Hey guys, what's up? Hang on, just adjusting my own volume here. I just basically decided to go live today for a little bit of an impromptu stream. We're going to do another stream later as well. That's going to be completely different. But I got an email this morning from a member of my locals community advising that I take a listen and possibly even do a reaction video to the great debate, apparently, that was had on Barry Weiss's podcast between David French and Chris Rufo. This debate is about the laws banning critical race theory. Of course, you all know that I do have very, very, very distinct opinions about why this should be legislated and how to do it. And I think that David French is full of crap and doesn't really know what he's talking about. But you know what? We're going to keep ourselves honest here and we are going to listen at least to some of it. I don't know how much we're going to get through because it's like an hour and a half long, but we're going to listen to some of it. And I am going to do a little reaction to it. So before we get started, guys, please mount that like button. That really helps me out. It helps counterbalance all the little trolls who have taken over my channel because they have nothing better to do with their life than brigade my YouTube channel. It's a fun thing. Now, I did mention that this idea came from a member of my locals community. Locals is the only sane place on the internet. And I'm going to be honest, guys, moving forward, I think I'm really going to not be interacting, at least in the comments section, on really any platform moving forward except for locals. Twitter is toxic, YouTube is toxic. I don't have the patience for it. I'm sorry. It's not you, it's me, or rather it is the bad apples. You know, it really is a shame because I really actually did like interacting in the comments on Twitter and on YouTube, and I learned a lot from people, and it was a way for me to be able to identify like trends and what people were thinking about early on. But unfortunately, the baddies have ruined it for everyone, or at least for me at the moment. I can't do it anymore. It's way too toxic. And so I will only be interacting really with members of my locals community. Locals is the only sane place on the internet. And the reason that we are able to keep locals sane is because it costs a little bit of money to be able to comment. Now, you can join for free just to check it out. You're going to get access to my videos ad free. You're going to get access to a whole community of people who are highly engaged, posting really great content. But if you want to kick it up a notch, you can join for $5 a month or for $50 a year, whatever floats your boat. And that gets you access to comment on everything, to interact with everything, to take part in our 2 Zoom calls that we do every single week. We're doing a debate club. We're doing a book club. We're doing all sorts of awesome things in my locals. I love my community so much. They keep me sane. And if you are sane too, you are welcome to come and join us. All right, we got some people strolling in here for this little impromptu stream. Now, I did mention I will be doing another stream later on today. And actually, let me just show you guys what that stream is going to be. Let me just show you guys what it's going to be. It's going to be this one right here. Can a voluntary society have nice things, with my friends Bill Barger and Dennis Pratt, both from the New Hampshire Libertarian Party? And we're going to come and have a little discussion. And mostly it's going to be them discussing, and I'm going to be sitting in the middle, kind of moderating between these two very handsome, distinguished gentlemen. But I really do value both of them. I think they both have a lot of great things to say. And I know it's not, I swear I'm not turning into a Liberty podcast. I swear I'm not. But on occasion, I do want to have these types of conversations. So excited to welcome both Bill and Dennis onto the channel later today. That's going to be around 6 p.m. tonight. So looking forward to that. All right. So the episode we are going to be listening to today, unfortunately, it's just audio, but we have it in Apple Podcasts with, it's honestly with Barry Weiss, and it's going to be the Rufo versus French episode. Now, I'm sorry, I did skip over a little bit of the beginning of the podcast. I wanted to get it right up to the debate. So we're going to listen to the debate between Chris Rufo and David French about whether or not critical race theory should be. Oh, look at that. We've already got trolls in the chat. Honest to God. Never a dull moment in my chat these days. So we're going to listen to this debate, and I'm going to be commenting on it. Now, listen, guys, this is a reaction video. So if you don't want me to pause and comment on what I'm listening to, and you just want to listen to it straight outright with no stops, no interruptions, I did link it in the description below, right down there. You can go and listen to it on your own, but I don't want to hear any complaining about me pausing and making comments on a reaction video, all right? Because that's exactly what this is. So we're going to listen for a little while and we're going to see how it goes. Now, my general opinion, just to be completely transparent at the beginning of this live stream, is that I absolutely believe that these laws are necessary. Now, I don't think that in the grand scheme of things, they're going to do a whole heck of a lot, but I think it's about throwing sand in their gears for right now. And I think it's also about making a statement of our values. And to be quite frank, I think a lot of the intellectuals who are intellectualizing about how horrible these laws are not existing in the real world and don't really understand what they're talking about. And many of them haven't even read the dang laws they're talking about. So we're going to see how David French is doing. But I'm going to be honest, I haven't been very impressed with David French's position on this so far. But who knows? He could turn me around. All right. Who is ready to start listening? If you're ready to give it a go, please type Y into the chat and mount that like button while you're there. Let me know. All right, no one's ready. That's all right. I'm just going to assume that there's a delay. Let's get started, folks. And let me know. Oh, actually, you know what? I need to do this. Why? Excellent. I need to do this a different way so we can actually hear the audio. Okay, hang on. Stand by. Share audio. All right, guys, let me know if you can't hear the audio. Let's kick it off.
Question then becomes, what should be done about all of this? Some Republican lawmakers in states around the country think they've come up with the right solution, and that solution is a ban to legally ban critical race theory from public schools. As it stands, there are more than a dozen states that have proposed bills banning or restricting the teaching of this ideology or passed them.
29 states, I think. Some more than a dozen, but okay.
Now, supporters of these bills
maybe not 29, maybe it's like 23 or something. It's like getting up there though. It really is.
Say that that's a no-brainer. In the same way that we would ban phrenology or Holocaust denial or criticize teachers that teach astrology as a real science, of course we should ban racial
astrology is a real science. I already don't like Barry Weiss. I'm just kidding.
essentialism.
No, I'm not. Astrology is real.
It's un-American. But critics of these,
except when Joshua pisses me off and then it is not real any longer. We'll see how it goes after today.
These bills say the bills are un-American. And that includes some really prominent civil libertarians who fear that these laws, some of which are vague and seem to almost outlaw the use of certain books in the classroom, that they betray bedrock American principles and that the unintended consequences of the ban could be worse than the ideas themselves. So a few weeks ago, I called up two of the most informed and engaged people that are arguing on opposite sides of this debate, Christopher Rufo and David French. If you have heard of the phrase critical race theory, it is likely because of the work of Chris Rufo. He has done the lion's share of reporting that has brought this issue into the mainstream. He's also been working with state lawmakers on many of these proposed bills. David French has had a long...
Twin Tails is asking, did I miss nothing remotely controversial? No, you didn't. No, you didn't. Last week, it was my fault that we didn't do it. This week, it was his. We'll see if we have a show next week. We will see.
Career as a lawyer, and he specializes in the First Amendment. When I met him when I was 20 years old and a student at Columbia, he ran the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, or FIRE. He has been outspoken in criticizing these bills, calling them at worst deeply un-American. Here is that debate in full. So, David French, Chris Rufo, I wanted to start with a few headlines that I've come across recently. The first one, an elementary school in Cupertino, California, is instructing third graders to rank themselves based on their power and their privilege. Here's a second one. San Diego School District told white...
Okay, I'm sure they're going to get into this in the course of the debate, but I feel like a need to set a baseline with this, because this is the thing that is so often overlooked when it comes to the critical race theory bans. Public schools are government funded. They are tools of the state. Public school teachers are employees of the state. The state does not have free speech protections. Individuals have free speech protections, the state does not. And so when we're talking about putting bans in public school, we are very literally talking about restricting the power of the state. That's what it is. It's not restricting individual freedoms, it's restricting power of the state. And this has already been ruled on by the Supreme Court. This is established law. It's not even really, to the very best of my knowledge, being challenged. And so this is something that I hope that they address it very directly. But anytime I hear the civil liberties argument when it comes to why we can't ban critical race theory, I'm sorry, it is overlooking the fundamental fact that the public schools are tools of the state, that public school teachers are state employees, and restricting what the state can do does not impact individual liberties. Robert Wills, thank you. Just wanted to wish you a blessed day. My brother Vid is in locals now. I have a blessed day. You have a blessed soul, Carlin. Thank you, Robert. I adore you. Thank you for being a part of my community.
Teachers that they are guilty of spirit murdering Black children. Here's another. In the name of equity, California's Department of Education is proposing to eliminate opportunities for accelerated math in the name of equity. So that means no algebra for 8th graders, no calculus for high schoolers. And those are just 3 examples from the state.
For the record, I got through calculus 2 in high school. I was already doing algebra when I was in like the 7th grade, so that kind of pisses me off. Even though I never did math again after high school. High school was as far as I got for math. Even though I was really good at it, I hated it.
Where I'm currently living in California, I could pull similar headlines from other cities, other towns, other states in America. So when I see all of this happening, probably like both of you, I'm disturbed by it. But I also feel torn between 2 virtues or 2 beliefs. On the one hand, it's a passionate commitment that I feel toward academic freedom, toward free speech.
There is no academic inquiry going on in K through 12 schools. I'm sorry. Like this is where intellectuals already they miss the goddamn bandwagon. There is absolutely no intellectual inquiry going on in K through 12 schools. There is no academic freedom to protect. No one is doing any original research that is actually going to matter in the grand scheme of anything in K through 12 schools. They're not even doing that in college, in the bachelor's degrees programs and the undergraduate programs. So like this argument that we have to protect academic inquiry, no, what we need to protect is developing brains from being indoctrinated into nonsense by being fed lies that they don't have the logic function of their brain to even begin to process. That is what we need to protect. You're not getting into academic inquiry until you're getting to master's or PhD programs at absolute best.
Toward robust public debate, to the basic idea that the answer to bad ideas is better ideas, not censorship and not government intervention. And on the other hand, I feel this personal opposition to elements of this ideology, to these policies that just feel like, frankly, like plain old racism, that feel like segregation. And that feels morally wrong to me and feels like it needs some kind of public remedy. And I don't know how to square these 2 principles. I see really compelling arguments on both sides.
It's really simple, Barry. Public schools are tools of the state. Public school teachers are employees of the state. This is not a civil liberties argument. There's also no academic inquiry going on in K through 12 schools. Show me a school. I would like an example. I would like an example of any K through 12 school in the country right now that is doing legitimate academic inquiry that would be impacted by these bills. I just want one example. Just one example. K through 12.
And one of the reasons that I want to talk to the 2 of you is because I think of everyone out there in the arena arguing about this. The 2 of you articulate those 2 pole positions most clearly, most passionately, and most convincingly. So I want to start with a super simple question, which is tie these headlines together for me. What is going on here? David, maybe we start with you.
it's hard to understand what is happening right now in the United States of America unless
No,
you
it's
have some
not.
understanding of fundamentalism. And that I think what is beginning to happen and what we're beginning to see happen is that in parts of the left and parts of the right, what we're essentially having is a kind of a fundamentalist religious awakening. And then when you're talking about these examples, you're talking about on the left, the far left. And I like the way that John McWhorter described it in The Atlantic. He calls it a sort of what third wave anti-racism. And it's he calls it a profoundly religious movement in everything but terminology. It's an idea that whites are permanently stained by white privilege. They are gaining moral absolution only by eternally attesting to it. That's like the original sin, that sometime America will come to terms with race, and that's sort of like its judgment day. Explorations as to whether an opinion is problematic are equivalent to explorations of what might be considered blasphemous. The social attacks on a person with problematic thoughts are parallels with excommunication. It's a very thoroughly...
Okay. Type Y into the chat if we think that this debate is going to be a lot of David French intellectualizing. Because that's already the impression that I'm getting. David French is going to do a lot of intellectualizing in this particular episode. Who is expecting David French to do an awful lot of intellectual? Yeah, exactly. I see those Y's already coming. All right. And guys, like, there's a difference. I'm sorry. Like, there is a difference between people who intellectualize up in the ivory tower in their little protected bubble and people who actually do this in the real world and talk to people in the real world and interact with parents and all this stuff. There is a fundamental difference in understanding. And I don't begrudge the intellectuals their space. The intellectuals are important. But at the end of the day, my opinion is that the intellectuals were part of creating this problem in the first place. And I don't think that intellectuals intellectualizing about this problem are going to be the ones to fix this problem. I actually think it's just going to make the problem worse if we are looking to the intellectuals to intellectualize about everything and not actually do anything in the real world.
Religious movement with a religious zeal behind it.
No kidding, David. We were there last year.
These headlines are talking about.
Like, we were literally there last year with what David French is talking about right now. So he's about a year late on this particular argument.
And a lot of this is connecting, and it's appealing to people because it connects with sort of an underlying sense of virtuous purpose. And that underlying sense of virtuous purpose is to purge the effects of racism from American life. And so you've got this underlying virtuous purpose, and that really animates people and gives them a sense that what they're doing, they're on the right side of something really important and really good. But as with so many fundamentalisms, it is so...
Ha ha ha! Naruto says Chris Rufo just tweeted out that his and James Lindsay's tweets are now being used in CRT training. I'll have to look that up and bring that up on the screen as we're listening to this, Naruto. Intellectuals should realize kids won't get it.
Entirely intolerant of dissent. And so entirely intolerant of disagreement, it often ends up oppressing in the name of liberation. And in fact, in some ways, that's the entire point. I mean, this is something that we've seen from, for example, the beginning of the speech code movement in academia, which really launched in the 1980s. The sort of idea that the best kind of tolerance was a form of intolerance of dissenting speech and speech that stands in front of the virtuous purpose. And that's sort of what we're dealing with in multiple sectors of American society right now.
Chris, do you agree with that? Do you see it from the John McWhorter lens of functioning like a kind of new religion?
Yes and no. I mean, I think there's certainly an argument that it could be interpreted as religious, but it's really a secular ideology. It's a totalizing ideology that stems not from a kind of wellspring of a transcendent vision of a spiritual order, but from kind of hardcore 1960s style neo-Marxist politics. And if you look at Herbert Marcuse, the critical theorist, he talks specifically, we need to engage in intolerance in order to shift the balance of society towards a explicitly left-wing and Marxist political vision. And that it is essentially should be okay and actually encouraged to push any kind of conservative or right-wing beliefs, ideologies, practices out of the national conversation, out of positions of power. And what's happening today is that our institutions are being devoured by this ideology that is intolerant at its heart, that is totalizing in its nature, and that is deeply destructive and explicitly antithetical to the American principles. And I think it's something that is much more akin to kind of the ferment of the 20th century Marxist movements. And I say that with knowledge that it's not the same thing, but my reporting has shown me something really interesting. I've talked to a lot of parents who oppose this ideology, are actually immigrants to the United States. So I had people from the former Soviet Union that said, what my daughter is going through in public school in America right now reminds me of my education in the Soviet Union in the 1980s. I talked to people who are Chinese immigrants in California in that school in Cupertino that you mentioned in your intro. They said, this reminds us of that same feeling we had when we survived the Cultural Revolution under Chairman Mao. And finally, I talked to an Iranian immigrant in Portland, Oregon, who leaked documents to me from the Portland public schools and said, I grew up in Iran chanting death to America before school every day as a small child. And I get that exact same horrific tingling up my neck when I look at what my child is learning in America. And the experience that I think they offer.
So I already want to note the difference between the approach that David French took, which was to intellectualize about the problem, and the approach that Chris Rufo is taking, which is to provide highly practical examples to show you that he's actually talking to people in the real world. He's seeing how this is practically applied. And these are just two fundamentally different perspectives. The intellectuals are not going to save us. If you cannot bring what you are doing out of the ivory tower and into the real world, then you are not going to save us. We don't have a whole lot of time left to beat this stuff back. We may already be too late, to be really honest with you. And if people don't start getting serious about how this works in the real world and what you need to do practically to fight back, then we really do not have a prayer. And Chris Rufo is one of the very few people that is actually doing that.
Is an outside perspective. They understand the virtues of America. They immigrated here in pursuit of that vision. But for some reason, I think we've gotten into this ideological fog where we don't understand these moral lines, and we're equivocating and we're tolerating this deeply fatalistic, pessimistic, destructive ideology that is taking over our institutions when we should be very clear in drawing the line and figuring out how to push back.
So you're saying at its heart, what this movement is really about, despite the language that it uses, social justice or equity or anti-racism, is about actually completely delegitimizing dissent? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and I mean, it's not me saying it. You can go look at the original writings that inspired this movement from...
It does delegitimize dissent. It doesn't allow for dissent. When Gabrielle Clark's son, William, tried to say, I don't want to say I'm an oppressor in high school, his principal told him, you have to say you're an oppressor in order to graduate. And when he refused, he was failed in a class and they threatened his graduation over it. So it does stifle dissent. There is absolutely no doubt that dissent is being stifled. Students, even the ones that are inclined to speak up, and most students are not inclined to speak up in any school, questioning the person that's in charge with giving them a grade. But even when they are inclined to speak up, they're not given any reason to believe that dissent would be tolerated. They're simply told this is the way that it is, and that your perspective is wrong, or you're privileged, or you're an oppressor, or you're just showing your white fragility, or whatever it happens to be.
Critical theory of the 1960s. You can look at the critical race theory of the 1990s. You could look at this whole intellectual lineage that calls either explicitly in the past for a moral, economic, and political revolution. That was the language they used in the 1960s. Liberation, revolution. What they did, though, is they repackaged a lot of those same core concepts, realizing that, neo-Marxist revolution is going to be a hard sell to, public school parents in a suburb of, Cincinnati. But equity, diversity, inclusion, anti-racism.
Literally, anytime they're saying equity, That's critical race theory. I just uploaded a school board meeting on my second channel, Actively Unwoke. And I uploaded the whole thing. I'm going to do some clips of it as well. But literally, like, the school board meeting was about the equity committee and the work that the equity committee was doing. And the superintendent actually sat at the head of, I think it was the superintendent, sat at the head of the table during the school board meeting saying, we're not doing critical race theory. We're not doing it. We're not doing it. We're not doing it. We're responding to the work of the equity committee. Anytime you hear the word equity, that is going to be critical race theory. 100%. There is no doubt about it. Equity is a made-up word in the critical race theory sense. It was only invented around like 2015 or so. Before then, it was only used in Wall Street and stuff like that for a totally different kind of equity. The way that they're using that terminology now was only invented a couple of years ago, and it was specifically for these purposes.
All things that are anodyne, soft, persuasive, and a rebranding of these very intense ideas. And what I've tried to do is to show under the cloak of this very soft language, what are the actual documents? What are the actual principles? What is the actual literature? What are the actual practices within our institutions? And what does this really mean? Because these are propaganda words very explicitly. And what I've tried to do is take it away from a theoretical debate and actually say, what is happening concretely, tangibly within our institutions?
I would love to unpack a phrase that I think a lot of Americans have been encountering for the first time in really the past few months. And that phrase is critical race theory. But people seem to have all kinds of understandings of what this means, what critical race theory is.
Does anyone in the chat want to take a stab at the definition of critical race theory before they give it a go? Who has been paying attention to my definition of critical race theory? Can anyone remember it? I would love to see you guys' answer in the chat. What is critical race theory? What is the concise, proper definition that I've been teaching for several weeks now? Probably months. I don't even know. And of course, there's a delay, so I'm just going to give you guys a second to chat it in. Then I'll share my definition, and then we'll see what they say. Let's see. Race determines outcomes in their worldview. I mean, yeah, that's a little bit. An ideology that came out of academia in the 70s that teaches that racism exists everywhere. Yes. Adrian, for the win. Watery Crabs had started in the 70s and teaches that we are defined by the color of our skin. Not really. It teaches that racism exists everywhere, in every system, in every institution, in every interaction, and that the job of the critical race theorist is to explore how racism occurred in every circumstance. Grandma Nay says, mount that like button.
What it is in ideology or theory versus what it is in practice. So, David, let's start with you. What the hell is critical race theory?
Yes, David.
Well, this is something, I mean, first, it's not new. I got to law school in 1991, and critical race theory, gender theory was the dominant intellectual movement in the law school at that time. I think of my professors, of sort of the major professors that I had, of the 6 major professors I had in my first year of law school, 5 of the 6 were what we called crits at the time. And one of the things that you quickly
notice that David has yet to give a definition of critical race theory. He's telling a story about his life instead. And I tell stories all the time. I think stories are really effective ways to make points, but I'm still waiting for that definition, David.
Learned was that there wasn't a single definition of critical race theory.
David says there is no definition of critical race theory, and that's why he's not giving us a definition. Okay.
You people can try to, quickly define it, and there are a lot of sort of shorthand versions of critical race theory, but there's a lot of argument within the field about what it is. And
the field is not honest about what it is, so I'm not entirely sure that we give 2 flips about what the field has to say. To
the extent that you're really going to be able to define it, I would say there's multiple components of it that are kind of common.
David French does not know what the definition of critical race theory is. That's what I'm learning so far. Did he not prepare? Did he not understand that in a debate about critical race theory, he was going to be asked to define the terms? Who wants to bet? Type Y into the chat if you want to bet that Chris Rufo is going to swoop in with a perfectly concise, consistent definition of critical race theory. Type Y into the chat if you believe in Chris Rufo, like I believe in Chris Rufo.
One is this idea that racism is ingrained in the fabric and system of American society, so much so that you don't have to be an individual racist, for example, to be a part of a racially oppressive system. That in many ways, often intent or individual intent is irrelevant to sort of the virtue of the system itself. That if you're going to look at sort of the root and branch of American society, it's steeped in racism. The other thing that you often have, not always, but you often have, is a rejection of traditions, for example, of small L liberalism. So you're going to reject the free, you're again going back to the speech code movement in the 1980s and early 1990s. You're going to reject free speech as a value, as an independent value. Liberating tolerance is a term for intolerance.
David French literally has no fucking clue what he's talking about. That's my position, and I'm sticking to it.
Intolerance of, in particular, status quo right-leaning ideas. And so you're going to have not always, but sometimes you're going to have a rejection of liberalism. And then, one of the things is that you're also going to have a rejection of sort of this notion of what you might call meritocracy. If you see, for example, a racial disparity in hiring, or you see a racial disparity in achievement, what you're seeing is sort of proof of a failure of equity. And that proof of failure of equity has to be remedied, often by blunt governmental force that will often override liberalism. And I keep going back to this because it's such a perfect example of sort of when you take critical race theory with these sort of three key concepts of inherent structural racism combined with a rejection of liberalism, combined with a rejection of meritocracy, where the first real wave of how this manifested itself in public policy was the university speech code. This was something where, beginning in the late 80s, going into the early 90s, you're talking about a wave of policymaking and public institutions designed to redress a lot of inequities in.
Does everyone understand why I have no faith in the intellectuals to save us? Is it clear? I worked in higher education for 10 years. These people ain't saving us from anything.
Small L liberalism. So again, lots of critical race theorists who would listen to what I just said would say, well, you're missing this or you're missing that. And, we haven't talked about sort of the intersectionality subcomponent. But that's basically how I would define it. Most strands of it contain those concepts.
What is dangerous about liberal values like free speech to this ideology?
Well, and that's a great question. And this goes to sort of the root and branch thesis. So if the Bill of Rights is coming from a structure, it's coming from a system that was also constructed at the same time through systems and mechanisms of oppression. And so if this constitutional structure is sort of the fruit of that same poisonous tree, then it has to be critiqued, it has to be interrogated, it has to be many elements of it.
Listen. I was up late last night and I'm working on my second giant mug of coffee. I don't even know what this guy's saying right now. I don't know, maybe it's I didn't get enough sleep. But I'm sitting here and my eyes are glazing. You know what it is? David French sounds like a goddamn critical race theorist. That's what it is. David French sounds like a critical race theorist. Oh my God. Norwich in the house. I worked in Norwich for 5 years, did my master's degree at Norwich.
Should be discarded.
The administration in Norwich sucks, but the people there are cool.
Let's put it this way. So, for example, my view of American history could be boiled down like this, at the risk of dramatic oversimplification. 1619 versus 1776. So 1619, when the first slaves come to the American shore, was sort of a symbol that this new world was going to be a lot like the old world. It was going to be suffering from the same oppressions. It was going to have the same kinds of exploitations. It was going to be a continuation of what had gone before. 1776 was a philosophical break from 1619. And so what in the history of America in blunt terms is this battle between 1619, the reality of 1619, and the principles of 1776. A critical race theorist might say, that's completely wrong, David. 1776 was an extension of 1619. It was how the ruling class granted itself liberty at the expense of everyone else, whereas I would say that's how America's leaders created a irreconcilable tension with 1619 that we then had to deal with. And we dealt with it in the Civil War. We kept dealing with it through the Civil Rights Acts, for example. That we've been dealing with that tension.
I'm seriously about to fast forward over everything David French has to say because I just don't even I don't even care anymore. I don't he didn't even answer the damn question. Shut up.
That's how Martin Luther King Jr., for example, is able to talk about America's promissory note. You made us a promise. And so
okay, I have a serious question. So when I don't do debates because I think the debates make me a horrible, evil person. And I'm not going to do this collegiate style debate thing where everyone is just super oh, here's my point and here's your point. And even though you're not speaking to my point directly, but I refuse to do it. If you guys saw the debate that I did on Gothic's channel like a month ago or something, and I just went in there and I was I don't really care what you have to say. This is the only perspective I care about. This is all I feel like talking about. And anything else I'm basically going to ignore. That is generally my debate style because I just don't care to have these conversations. So here's my question. Which do you guys prefer? Do you prefer someone who just says, here's what I think and here's why I think it, and I don't really care if you disagree with me or not? Or do you prefer David French style debate where he goes on and 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 on about something for 15 minutes and doesn't actually say anything? Because I always get a lot of heat when I do my style of debate, but I find it far preferable to something like this, to be really honest. At least I said something. I made good points. Might not like my tone, but what can you do?
1776, when you said all men are created equal. And the critical race theorists in many ways just flat out would disagree with that and would say that 1776 is an extension of 1619 rather than an opposition to 1619.
Well, you bring up Martin Luther King. I'm curious, Chris, how would a critical race theorist or someone that believes broadly in that ideology, whether or not they use that language, how would they understand someone like Martin Luther King?
I'm going to tell you, I know what the answer to this is. I know what the answer to this is because I got in a fight with Martin Luther King's daughter on Twitter. Okay, the answer to this is that the critical race theorist would not believe that Martin Luther King went far enough in what he was doing. It's kind of like what Kendi says. Oh, what did Kendi say? Oh, God, I have it on my desktop somewhere. Hang on, let me see if I can find the Kendi thing real quick. I hope I can find it because I was going to quote it for something later. No, it's not there. Hang on. I'm going to find the Kendi thing. Dang, I don't know if I am going to find the Kendi thing. Well, Kendi basically said something like you can only fight discrimination by making more discrimination or something like that. It was some quote like that. But critical race theorists generally do not believe that Martin Luther King went far enough in his application. They think that he should have gone past just we should all be treated based on the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. And they think that if he had stayed alive, he would have gone further to go for reparations and retribution, for lack of a better term. That's what they would say.
And his ideas.
Well, my reading of it is that you can look at two strains of thought in the 1950s and 1960s within
found it.
Black intellectual.
Hang on, I found the Kendi quote. Okay, hang on. Kendi said, the only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. That's Adrian, man. Adrian, every time. Thank you, Adrian. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about right there. There is the Kendi quote.
Community where you had the Malcolm X, Angela Davis, Black Panther Party, Black Power movement that was much more militant in its ideology, explicitly communist in the case of Angela Davis. And then you had the civil rights movement that had a very different philosophical approach. And I think that looking at the intellectual lineage of those approaches is really instructive, where Angela Davis was actually Herbert Marcuse's doctoral student. She was a member of the Communist Party, believed in the overthrow of the United States form of government, the overthrow of capitalism. And it was an explicitly Marxist and explicitly atheist and explicitly anti-American worldview. Whereas the civil rights leaders, like Martin Luther King, that we're talking about now, it was David's idea is, I think, exactly right. That promissory note. He actually appealed to the founders and the founding of the country, I think, in a rhetorically and strategically brilliant way, and also a true way, to say, this is what was promised. This is what was fought for in the Civil War. We have to take that next step towards fulfilling the idea and the American principle of equality. And you can't also underestimate that it was an explicitly, especially in the South, Christian movement, where that was another main element. So critical race theorists find them in this very strange tension. And I think that they want to have it both ways in their rhetoric. They want to say that we are the new civil rights movement, even though their ideology is derived from the Black radical movement of that time that frankly lost out, was vanquished and overshadowed by the nonviolent civil rights movement. So
Yo, Shelby. Kendi makes 7 figures. Kendi doesn't make 6 figures. Kendi makes 7 figures. I guarantee you Kendi makes 7 figures.
The critical race theorists, they have to reckon with this. And I think up until now that we've actually been pushing back, they've been able to basically use the cover of the civil rights movement, use the halo effect of Martin Luther King to claim the mantle. But I think if you look at the specifics, if you look at the facts, if you look at the literature, if you look at the practice, if you look at the investigative reporting, they're practicing something underneath that is much more pernicious, much more militant.
I think that Chris Rufo has a lot more faith than I do that these people are going to be held to account in order to explain what they're doing. I don't think that's going to happen. What I think is going to happen, and because this is the rule book that they play by, once they get caught doing one thing, all they do is shift gears and they go into another thing. And so I don't think that they're going to be held to account for anything. I think what they're going to do is try to change the name of critical race theory to make it appear as though they're doing something different, when in fact they're doing the same thing they always did. They're just going to call it something different.
Much more radical, that is being subsidized by public dollars.
I guess I want to ask, it's striking to me to hear you talk about Angela Davis, who's, I think a few months ago in the pages of Vogue magazine, which gives you a sense of the cultural, the way that her ideas in a way have moved into the cultural mainstream, at least let's say in elite America. What do you guys think the goal of this ideological movement is? What's the most generous read of what they're trying to do?
I would say if you're gonna do what's the term from Twitter, steel manning it.
Yes.
So if you're going to steel man it, I think the goal is to end the negative consequences of, 365 years of legally enforced racial discrimination protected by violence.
David French is a critical race theorist. Change my mind. No, that's not the goal of any of this. The entire goal of this, it's not about fairness. It's not about justice. It's not about equality. It's not about making sure everyone has equal access to opportunities. It is not about any of those things. And this is, again, why the intellectuals are only causing problems in this entire discussion, because they are making it out to seem as though this is an altruistic strategy that just cares about people and just wants to undo the wrongs of the past. And that is not what it is. What it is trying to destabilize our entire system. That is exactly what it is. And like, the one thing that people need to wrap their heads around when it comes to critical race theory is that the number one goal of critical race theory is to destabilize the system. The number one goal of all of this. And a lot of things a lot of things that are going on that might not seem directly related to critical race theory. Critical race theory is, I'm kind of using it as the banner for everything right now, but everything that the woke left is doing is 100% entirely designed to destabilize our system. And once you understand that critical component, once you understand that destabilization is the goal, because it is the destabilization of the system that is going to allow them to have more power. Once you understand that one key component, all the rest of their actions make sense. But David French doesn't know what he's talking about, and he still thinks it's about fairness or justice, and he is wrong.
Violence. So if you look at American history, and this is something that, we haven't yet talked too much about, is that, from 1619 to 1964, we had some form of legally mandated malicious discrimination in this country. And the things that I have benefited from some scholars in critical race theory is that they have showed me how deeply that 365 years, if I'm doing my math correctly, has impacted various systems of American life in such a way that this sort of straight ahead view of everything's okay if we just sort of change the law. And
so is David French arguing for reparations? Is that what he's arguing for? Is that what he thinks would be the solution here?
And we create a quote unquote level playing field and everything's going to be okay.
Mhm.
So I would say the steel manning is that there was 365 years of malicious racial discrimination defended by violence. You don't get rid of 365 years of oppression in the years from 1964 to 2021. And sometimes government power has to be used to do that. And so that's sort of the steel manning view, I would say. It's a desire to create an equitable society that is cleansed of that 365-year stain. That's how I would sort of steel man that position.
Chris, would you agree with that?
I was waiting for him to say no. Karina says, should we not be calling it critical theory under the umbrella of critical race theory gender? I mean, I think that we kind of know that when we're saying critical race theory, we're speaking under that general umbrella, but it's also, to be really honest with you, it is actually much bigger than that umbrella as well. And we're just, the language that I'm using is taking a specific term to mean a broad set of ideas, some of which, technically fall under the very specific definition of critical race theory, but also, when I use it, I'm more so talking about just like woke culture in general, and critical race theory right now just happens to be like the giant pink elephant in the middle of the room. But I don't think it's useful to limit ourselves to just like, here is specifically what goes under critical theory and blah 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 blah, because then we're getting into the avenue of intellectualizing with the intellectuals, and we get so focused in on the definitions of things that we miss the larger picture and the larger impact of what's going on.
I mean, I would personally agree with that. That sounds like a noble and a good and a true goal for our society, right? We should also acknowledge, anyone that looks at American history would acknowledge a history of slavery, racism, segregation, discrimination. That was pervasive. It was deeply destructive. And, I directed a film for PBS where I spent 3 years in a Memphis, Tennessee public housing project and the surrounding neighborhood. And you can see it. I mean, this is Memphis is famously the kind of northern tip of the Mississippi Delta. And you can see the legacy and the residual effect of historical racism everywhere in that community. So I think that that's correct and true and should be remedied. And we should all be invested emotionally, financially, intellectually, in every way in trying to figure out, how can we right this wrong? How can we make sure that once we have a regime of equal rights in the legal system, we actually have a regime of equal dignity for all human beings, including those who have been historically discriminated against? But I think that's actually a majority position. And I don't think that's what actually distinguishes critical race theory from a majority position that I think spans the ideology.
This is why I hate these debates so freaking much, because Chris Rufo just spent like 5 minutes trying to placate David French by saying, yes, you were right that these are all bad things. Yeah, we all think that those are bad things. No one disagrees on that. Literally, no one disagrees on that. And in that moment, we've taken the debate off of critical race theory and said, well, do you really think, Chris Rufo, do you really think that racism is bad? Of course, everyone thinks racism is bad. No one disagrees that racism is bad, except for the 30,000 or so white identitarians who are much more powerful than people think, but that's another story for another day.
Spectrum. I think critical race theory is unique because it argues in a very pessimistic way that actually the Constitution, the legal order, the economy, the American state itself are irredeemably racist. And it argues in some places, and even in the pages of the New York Times with Charles Blow recently, he said, racism has been as pervasive and destructive and deeply embedded today as it was 100 years ago or 200 years ago or 300 years ago. Critical race theory, rejects rationalism, individualism, capitalism, Enlightenment values, constitutionalism.
Ding, ding,
And
ding.
it's a much more radical critique than just saying we want to, fix the legacy of historical racism.
Okay, so I'm going to give you guys some helpful feedback, and I say this with love. You've got to stop doing this. You got to stop doing this. I don't get, like, he goes by Ibram X. Kendi. He is an adult. He gets to decide what name he wants to use. I feel the same way about Caitlyn Jenner. Like, it's just like you win literally no battles when the thing you're defaulting to is, well, he's not using his real name and here's his real name. Like, I truly don't understand what you guys think you're winning when you're doing this. So I say this with love. I genuinely do. You win nothing with those arguments. And every single time you make one of those arguments, you could be making a better argument against what Ibram X. Kendi is saying. If you believe in freedom, then you should believe in the freedom for an adult man to use whatever flipping name he wants, or an adult woman in the case of Caitlyn Jenner, because that is how she has chosen to identify. And as an adult who came to this decision as an adult, people should be celebrating that. That's what freedom means. It means so that people have the freedom to make a different decision than you might make.
And this is documented everywhere. If you look at someone like Cheryl Harris writing in the Harvard Law Review in a founding paper, she argues that, private property rights were created to maintain white supremacy, and therefore we should suspend private property rights and redistribute land and wealth on a racial basis. I mean, that's like land reform and basic Marxism 101, as we saw historically. And if you look at today's kind of latest critical race guru, Ibram Kendi, he's written pieces where he says we need to create a federal department of anti-racism that is unaccountable to any other branch of government, so a new branch of government. And it should have the power to regulate the speech of political leaders. If it's not deemed anti-racist, we should have the power to censor it. There goes your First Amendment. And it should also have the power to veto, nullify, or abolish any law at any level of government that doesn't lead to anti-racist outcomes. So there's the end of your system of federalism. There's the end of your system of a balance of power. And there's the end of your democratic system fundamentally. If voters cannot change the policy of this hoped for Department of Anti-Racism, it is undemocratic. And because it can use power, anything that is statistically deemed not anti-racist, which you can make an argument through statistical manipulation that almost anything could be deemed so. You have, in essence, an end of the American regime and the beginning of a near omnipotent or totalitarian regime. And so I think when you actually break down and you ask critical race theorists, they get very uncomfortable. What do you want? What do you recommend? You see revealed an ideology that, again, is very...
He just finally hit on the point. I wish he had gotten there quicker, but he hit on the point. Is like, what does success look like? What do you want? Because, I mean, like, there are very few actual laws on the books that we could still consider systemic racism. So what does success look like? What is your vision for what you're trying to achieve? Not just saying what you don't want to achieve. And by the way, the right could learn from this as well. And actually, I won't even say the right anymore. I need to stop saying the right, because I think that the right is absolutely useless in this fight overall. The people fighting back against critical race theory, we could say the same for us. What are we trying to achieve? What does our version of success look like? What I've landed on is that our version of success should be a color indifferent society based on meritocracy, which is that we treat everyone the same regardless of the color of your skin. We make sure that we are doing the very best we can to make all opportunities available for everyone. But you got to show up and you've got to work hard. That's where I would like to reframe things, but I'm open to feedback on that.
little different than the kind of cultural revolutionary policies that you saw in the 20th century. And I think it's almost certain that when you abandon individual rights, when you abandon free speech, when you abandon balance of power, when you abandon federalism, you're going to get the same results as those 20th century regimes did. And so I think we should not fall for the Mott and Bailey trick that this is just about understanding racism. This is just about teaching the real history of the United States. When you actually read the literature, when you listen closely, and when you do some very basic analysis, tracing this ideology into the past, a picture emerges that is very different. And I think you could steelman that argument as well. But I think to take the Mott and Bailey as the real ideology, I think is a mistake.
Let's define Mott and Bailey just for a minute. I imagine it's the chasm between what the slogan or the language or the rhetoric that something hides behind and that the content of it is actually different.
That's right. It's defending a position that's easy to defend when your actual position is something that's more difficult to defend. So it's a rhetorical strategy to create distance from what you're saying and what you really mean.
You know, one of the interesting things that I think we're seeing right now is we're seeing an attack on, again, we're going to go back to this term, small L liberalism. So I think a lot of critical race theorists, again, not all, but a lot of critical race theorists are exactly in in alignment with what Chris is talking about, in the sense that to achieve the ends that they want to achieve, liberalism has to be discarded to a greater or lesser degree, sometimes entirely. Classical liberalism.
Okay, we can agree on that, David French.
It's interesting. We're seeing a lot of that happening on the right. That's a very big intellectual argument on the right now, that instead of social justice, the words are common good, and that liberalism itself is incompatible ultimately with human flourishing, that liberalism itself is at odds with human flourishing and justice. And so it's really interesting to me. And this is
where are we seeing that argument? Honestly, I have not seen that argument anywhere. Where are we seeing that argument that liberalism is contradictory to human justice?
Something, you know, this is something that I encountered 30 years ago. It's something I litigated over for years and years and years and years, was in the preservation of this classical liberal American system of government that says, no, liberalism is not incompatible with justice. Liberalism, small L liberalism, is indispensable to justice. Free speech is not incompatible with justice. To quote Frederick Douglass, it's the great moral renovator of society and government. And so what we often end up having is a situation where, you know, the Mott and Bailey is often, well, I'm for racial justice. Okay. I am too. Then the ends means argument. Okay, so therefore we need to radically restrict free speech, for example, or we need to suppress dissent, or we need to engage the government in X, Y, and Z. And I say, whoa, I don't want to do that. Wait, I thought you were for racial justice. And that's kind of like the Mott and Bailey. And so what we're beginning to see, and we've seen from the far left, is this attack on liberalism. We're also seeing it from the far right. You know, I can throw down quotes from Adrian Vermeule, Harvard law professor, that you'd think, wait, that's the right?
Yeah, you're not going to convince me that a Harvard law professor is on the far right, David French. I'm sorry. You're not going to convince me of that. Now, is the alt-right absolutely making an attack on liberalism? Oh yeah, I see it every single day. Every single time I'm told to bend the knee, and when they demand that I say critical race theory is anti-white or else they're going to keep attacking my channel, I see it every day. So it is true that that's happening, but I'm not entirely sure I'm going to buy the argument that it's happening from a Harvard law professor on the alt-right.
Hold on. So I think one of the central projects of our time is this defense of small L liberalism, and the persuasion to the American people, including people who want to see social justice, who want to see the common good, that liberalism is indispensable to that, not an obstacle to it. And I think that's one of my biggest beefs with critical race theory, is an argument that this small L liberalism is an obstacle to eliminating the legacy of explicit racial discrimination, rather than indispensable to eliminating the legacy of malicious racial discrimination.
Who is making?
I think David really gets it right.
Okay, Barry. I'm still gonna go back to the fact that who is making this argument that liberalism is antithetical to justice? Where is that coming from? I have not heard that anywhere that I can recall, not coming from the right anyway.
When he is describing the assault on the liberal project from the right and the left. And for me, this goes beyond the headlines. I see, in the sort of intellectual trajectory of a lot of people that I admire who not 5 years ago maybe would have identified as neoconservatives or neoliberals, although we didn't really use that word then.
I don't understand why people care about all these labels. Anytime someone's like neoliberal, neoconservative, my eyes literally start to glaze over, and I'm like, why do we care? Honestly, what value does it add to the equation to have 18,000 billion bajillion labels? It's kind of like the social justice people, right? Like they have to have a label for everything. What does it matter what we call it when we're not focusing on what it actually does in the real world?
Liberals who are sort of being pulled to where I see the great energy sources in politics right now. I don't see it in the center right and the center left. I don't see it in small L liberalism. I see the energy really on the extremes. And I'm wondering if you guys can reflect, maybe Chris, starting with you.
How are we defining extreme? How are we defining extreme? I have a very good idea of what extremism looks like on the left. I don't like, and I have an idea of what I think extremism looks like on the right, but I don't see the major pushback on the right coming from the most extreme people. I see a lot of moderate people on the right pushing back against critical race theory. So what does it mean to be like a moderate right winger? I mean, if we're going to talk about labels, let's actually have a real conversation about labels, right? Let's see. I see a super chat coming in. I'm just waiting for it to pop up on the screen. Janice Zeal says, by labeling something, we espouse control over it. Yeah, you're probably right about that.
And why you think that is? Why are people turning against small L liberalism? Why does that seem like the weak position, frankly, right now to so many people?
I think it's a bit of a false equivalence to say, well, there's the illiberal left and the illiberal right, and they're both threatening to destroy or overthrow the liberal order. There's people on maybe what I would call the post-liberal right, like Harvard professor Adrian Vermeule, like Patrick Deneen at Notre Dame. I find them all to be important voices that offer a critique of liberalism from the right that I think in many regards offers insight to the weak points of neoliberal, neoconservative rule. But personally, I'm not persuaded by their arguments. I think they're best used as a way to find the problems with liberalism and then fix them within this liberal, democratic American system. But the fact is that those are probably 5 or 6 people. It's a very, very small group of intellectuals on the right, while critical race theory and the related illiberal left ideologies dominate public school system. They dominate the university system. They dominate the media. They have a hegemonic position in all of our major institutions. So which one in the world of practical political power, not in the world of theoretical ideas, you could extrapolate them that if they became the dominant regime would be a problem, but actually what's happening in the real world today, I think it's almost astonishing to even compare them. I don't see how they could be viewed as a kind of equal balance on the fringes.
I think we're way underestimating what's happening on the right.
I'm
a
really?
believer
Tell
in
us,
Miles'
David.
law, which is sort of this law of bureaucratic, a law of bureaucracy that actually I think applies in our lives, which is where we stand is based on where we sit. In other words, our personal experience, our direct experience in our lives dictates an awful lot about what we think about the world writ large. So there's this really interesting tool that the New York Times put out, which was...
So now David is going to refer to a tool created by the New York Times to tell us about the right. Okay. All right. Let's give it a go.
Find your bubble. What's your bubble like? So put in your address And then when you put in your address, you'll see what percent are independent, what percent are Republican, what percent are Democrat where you live. So my bubble, I'm in a bubble.
The New York Times is advising, wait, hang on. David French just advised you to use the New York Times to spy on their neighbors to find out what their political leanings are as a way to indicate what you believe. If I want to know what my neighbor's political leanings are, I will go and ask them. I will actually have a conversation about it. I'm not going to look at whatever they happen to be registered as and take that as the end-all be-all for what they believe. Wow.
Bubble, y'all. 85% Republican in my neighborhood, 15% Democratic.
I mean, I'm in the exact opposite ratio. Exact opposite.
Exactly. I've got a problem. I went and looked back at all of my previous addresses in my adult life, and I was either in a red or blue bubble for every one of them.
What on earth makes you think that the people that you live around are your primary influences in terms of what you believe? We literally just spent an entire year in a pandemic where people were not even talking to each other, not even leaving their homes. Why would the most popular or the most profound influence be what they happen to, the people they happen to live around? I don't even know half my neighbors. I've lived in my house for like 10 years. I do not even know half my neighbors. If I was walking down the street, wouldn't be able to identify them. So I'm not sure where David French is getting this idea that who lives around you are your primary influencers when it comes to politics.
But I'm in a bubble. And in this bubble,
you're in a
the
bubble, David.
dominant
You are.
influence
Not
is
the one you
what
think
you would
you're
call
in.
anti-wokeness. And so there is very little tolerance at all. And there's a lot of cancel culture here around any sort of questions about race. You know, it's woke if you're questioning qualified immunity, for example, which is something that I have been writing a ton about, which is a doctrine, for those who don't know, that contradicts a federal civil rights statute from the 1870s that says that if a agent of the government violates your civil rights, they shall be liable to you. And what qualified immunity does is it protects people who actually violate your civil rights from being liable to you. That's woke, you know. And so we're in this red bubble where anything that's sort of raising, wait a minute, you know, like these concepts that Chris and I agreed on about this legacy and the effects of.
Did they really agree, though? Did they really? Did they really? Or did David French drone on about equality for a whole heck of a long time? And then Chris Rufo came in and said, yeah, I disagree with racism too, but can we talk about critical race theory? I don't agree with David French's premise that they actually agreed. I disagree.
Racism that we're trying to deal with, oh, you're woke. I don't want to listen to you. And that's something that is endemic around here. It's just endemic. And so, you know, and some of the, you know, the challenges to small L liberalism, well, the people who took the Capitol on January 6th, they might say that, you know, they were patriots. That's what they called themselves. But I can, in my lifetime, it was
people that took the Capitol? Took the Capitol? Okay. Sean says, French is clearly a fool, no real complex thought. Yeah. Intellectuals gonna intellectualize.
one of the most tangible assaults on America's governmental structure I've seen. And so I think a lot of this is, what world do you live in? Barry, for example, you've been in the middle of a rise of illiberal leftism, and your personal experience in that, in many ways, is just chilling. It's just chilling, that rise and that fundamental intolerance. Liberalism is what it does, not what it says. And so cancel culture, to me, properly defined, is illiberalism. Even if you say you're doing it for the sake of liberalism, sort of like burning the village to save the village, then what you're doing is it's a rise of its actual illiberalism in practice. No matter if you're saying, I'm going to suppress the First Amendment for the sake of free speech. I don't buy that. If you're suppressing or impairing the First Amendment, it's an attack on liberalism. And so we have bubble ideologies in this country that are increasingly, viciously intolerant. And that's, no matter what you say about your intentions, the test of liberalism, small L liberalism, I think, is often, how do you deal with in-group dissent? How do you deal with in-group debate? And we got a real problem with that in this country.
You know what? Okay,
I imagine that the thing with Chris,
hang on. I'm gonna throw David French a bone. I agree with what he says there. The test of how you how liberal you really are is about how you deal with in-group debate. I am in 100% agreement on that. And this is why I hate the right so much, because I think they're horrible about this. I think that they are awful. I think that they become petty, petulant children when you disagree with them. I'm sorry for people on the right. And if you don't think I'm describing you, then don't take offense. But that's been my general experience with the right, is the minute that they think that you disagree with them, they become petty, petulant children that just kick their legs and throw a temper tantrum. And so I don't think that they are going to be the bastions of liberalism. I also don't think that the left is going to be the bastions of liberalism. Maybe the libertarians will do it. I don't know. I'm hopeful. Fingers crossed. No, I just described the right. If you have any questions about this, you can go look in the comments on my last month's worth of videos.
Would respond to, David, is, yeah, I believe that you're in an intolerant.
Yeah, I have experienced it on the right more than I've experienced. I have been canceled, guys. The reality is this: I have been canceled more by the right than I have by the left, and the cancellations that I've undergone have been more vicious on the right than they have by the left. So if you think that the right is the bastion of liberalism, just wait until you say something that they disagree with, and you're going to find out very, 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 very quickly that they are not the bastions of liberalism. The right loves you when you agree with them. The right hates you when you do not agree with them. That's why the people that are the most successful on the right always just whisper sweet nothings in the ear of their audiences. They've been attacking my YouTube channel for the last month. They've been brigading my YouTube channel for the last month. Go look at all my recent videos. Go look at what they've done. They've absolutely destroyed the effectiveness of my YouTube channel. Now, thankfully, I don't really rely on YouTube. I rely on my locals community. So I'm very, very grateful that they didn't actually, really do the damage that they wanted to do at the end of the day. But they've destroyed my YouTube channel because I disagreed with them, because I refused to say the critical race theory was anti-white.
Tolerant red bubble, where, being David Frenchian is considered an insult, as it sometimes is used on Twitter. And that, you're viewed as a pushover, or a coward, or a squish, or whatever derogatory word they would use. And that's bad and that's wrong. But David, come on.
Well, hang on. I'm looking for a chat. Well, Tim Pool has a penis and a haircut that they don't hate. And so I think it's a little bit different.
The people in your town in Tennessee aren't the people actually in power. If we look at the people actually in power that control newspapers and publishing houses and museums and Hollywood and big tech and corporations, they're all ascribing to this other kind of illiberalism, the kind that comes from the left.
Well, they're in power in Tennessee. They're in power in churches. I mean, so what are the institutions that people actually live in here? And, so that's one of my issues with some of this anti-woke legislation is these are people in power who are proposing, not all of them, but the ones.
All right. This is the last time I'm going to address this topic. This is not writing comments. They have tried to destroy the efficacy of my YouTube channel. Absolutely destroy it. They report every single video. They thumbs down every single video. They do smear pieces. They lie. They cut things out of context. So if you want to keep going with this, you're welcome to, but I'm just going to categorize you in the same category as them, and we're going to see what happens with that, because my patience on all this nonsense is just done at this point.
I've read, by and large, statutes that just flat out violate the Constitution. That's very meaningful. It's more meaningful than a.
And see now I'm starting to get comments in the chat the right is yeah, and we're starting to see it right before our very eyes. I said something the right disagrees with, and they're going to behave like spoiled, petulant little children who are going to kick their heels and throw a temper tantrum. And when you do that, you will get put in a timeout at first, and if you continue to do it, then you will be blocked. I am having no further patience for this nonsense. If you want to act like a child, you are not welcome on my channel. Go somewhere else.
Diversity training problem in a local corporation.
Yeah, we should absolutely get to some of the legislation, and I disagree
We should get to the
strongly with that
legislation.
interpretation. But Barry, you anticipated my position correctly. Is that the example that David used was the storming of the Capitol on January 6th. I condemned it the day of as it was happening. I thought it was a disaster, a debacle, a disgrace, a truly awful moment. Perpetuated by the former president's
I'm actually really. Hang on, I'm gonna let him finish, and I have a thought about this.
worst instincts and worst character flaws and delusions. But
see, I'm actually really disappointed in Chris Rufo for this. I have to say, I'm very, very disappointed in him for taking this stance because, listen, everyone and their mother has condemned the couple hundred people who went in the Capitol that day, but there were tens of thousands, at least 50,000 people on that Capitol lawn that were standing around, chanting their chants and waving their flags, and were there because there was supposed to be a scheduled rally. And I really wish, if we're talking about liberalism for a second, I really wish that we would have an honest conversation about what actually happened at the Capitol that day, because I was there, and most of the people there weren't doing anything. Weren't doing anything of note. A couple hundred people went in the Capitol. They shouldn't have. And that has been universally condemned. But to like, again, like take like he just took left-wing talking points and repeated them as though they were true. And I really wish he hadn't done that. But no, Tim Pool does not have hair. Confirmed.
I think that
at least confirmed by pictures on the internet. I don't know.
The idea of comparing that moment to this vast institutional power of the illiberal left is, again, a comparison of something that is real and pervasive and dominant.
See, and now the people in the chat are going, don't block people who disagree with you. I'm going to block people who are being disruptive to my chat, guys. I am. And I'm not going to feel bad about it. If you don't want to be blocked, then don't behave like a spoiled, petulant child. It's really that simple. My patience is gone. And if these are rules that you cannot follow, then you don't have to be on this channel. Like I said, they've already done the worst to my channel. They can't do anything more. And I rely on my locals community anyway. So if you want to be here, great. If you don't want to be here, that's fine too.
And hegemonic to something that was essentially a theater of the absurd spectacle, where you have the QAnon shaman, the guy with the pelts and the horns, standing at the Senate. It's not a coup d'etat. He's not going to become the president. It actually revealed to me the impotence and the weakness of this kind of right movement, where they assembled a mob, they stormed the Capitol, but it was an empty.
There was no assembling of any mob. People showed up because there was supposed to be a rally there. It always goes like, I thought we were going to talk about legislation. I thought that we were going to talk about what are the actual bills and why, like, if we don't get to the legislation part soon, I'm going to fast forward. Sean says maintaining liberal process is essential, but that includes keeping out toxic illiberal ideology like CRT. French misses the paradox of tolerance. Yes, he does. I 100% completely agree.
Spectacle that was, again, a disgrace, but to compare that to a ideological movement that controls universities, K through 12 education, the federal bureaucracy, the largest media organizations, increasingly Fortune 500 companies, I think that those two things are categorically incomparable in my view.
David, what do you think?
I just dispute that this radical CRT controls all of these institutions. I think for a lot of institutions.
David French doesn't believe that critical race theory is actually in any major institution, apparently. Okay. Another piece of evidence that David French doesn't know what the hell he's talking about.
Is it some window dressing that they put in?
No.
Particularly when you're talking about sort of the diversity training world, the idea that they control these institutions would be news to a lot of these critical race theorists.
Well, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the institutions are being devoured by the ideology, which is different than to say the critical race theorists who are, ensconced in academic positions. Certainly they're not calling the shots, but this ideology is pervasive. In the closing moments of the Biden campaign, it was equity, equity, equity. Everything since then has been equity. You see, racial segregation, resegregating public institutions now happening all over the country.
Yep.
You see the idea of distributing medical services on the basis of race becoming policy in many states.
You absolutely see some of these things, but what you used a word like hegemonic. I think that's way overblown. Way overblown.
What evidence do you have, David?
Because if
What
it was
evidence?
hegemonic,
Evidence.
we would have a real problem producing this podcast. We would have a
No.
real problem speaking. We would have a real problem standing against this.
You would have a real problem producing this podcast if Barry Weiss still worked for the New York Times, but because Barry Weiss is completely independent now and is funded independently of any major organization, she's able to produce whatever fucking content she wants. And that, David, is the point. If this podcast existed under the banner of the New York Times, this discussion would not even be happening because Chris Rufo is 100% correct.
It's not hegemonic. It's certainly influential. There's no question about that. And the interesting thing is, what I want people to be able to do is I want people to understand that within the structure that we have the antibodies to resist the worst elements of this. So, for example, I wrote a long piece the other day about how federal civil rights law is actually going to be a bulwark against the worst elements of critical race theory. So, for example, when you begin to see segregated employment practices, that's going to violate Title VII. That's going to violate Title VI. There's already a building wave of litigation against this. We have an incredibly robust legal system that can withstand these worst elements of it.
All right, let's interrupt whatever David French is joining on about. Alexandra says, hey, happy Wednesday. Have you mounted that like button yet? Thank you, Dr. K, for everything you do. You are truly invaluable. I cannot wait for your new book. I can't wait for it either. I can't wait to be done writing it so I can have a life again. Like this close. I'm so fucking close. I'm like this close. This close. Ugh.
So I guess what I often object to is this idea that it's somehow hegemonic, because what's happening is when you say that something is bigger than it is, it then creates a backlash that is disproportionate to the threat. And that, again, gets us to some of this anti-woke legislation.
Is David French arguing that the backlash to critical race theory is more substantial than critical race theory itself, and it's in the fact that it's in every major institution in the country? That's the argument that we're having? Hey, Jeremy, I put you in timeout to give you a warning, buddy. Now you're getting blocked. Congratulations.
Which flat out is unconstitutional. I mean, it's just not going to survive a court challenge if they are passed in their present state. And what I'm consistently getting worried about on the right, and I never thought I would see this because I sort of came up on a right that was very centered around the First Amendment. And, I was part of a speech code litigation project that challenged speech codes from coast to coast. And consistently a basic thesis of the conservative movement was, we're going to defend the First Amendment. We're going to defend academic freedom.
Yeah.
And then now what we're beginning to see is it's almost like, well, the left is too powerful for us to continue to defend the First Amendment in the same way. We have to degrade the First Amendment.
All right. For those of you who were not here at the beginning of the live stream, we need to go back and reiterate a lesson that we taught at the beginning of the live stream. And if you sat through it, I apologize. You can sit through it again. Public schools are government-funded institutions. Public school teachers are employees of the state. When you are restricting speech that public school teachers can utilize in front of their classrooms, you are not restricting free speech or civil liberties, because the Supreme Court has already ruled that public school teachers, because they are employees of the state and acting on behalf of the state, do not have free speech protection when it comes to K through 12 schools. They can say whatever they want in their private lives, but when they are acting as an employee of the state, as an agent of the state, by standing in front of that public school class and teaching their lessons, they do not have free speech protections because they're employees of the state. The bills around critical race theory that would ban it, quote unquote, in K through 12 education are putting restrictions on the state, not on the individual. And this is something that is completely missed time and time and time and time and time again when the intellectuals are having these arguments. And I'm also going to add on the addition that there is no academic inquiry going on in K through 12 schools. Academic inquiry does not start until college and usually not until master's degree programs. You are not inhibiting academic freedom and freedom of inquiry when you are talking about restricting what government what government employees can teach in government funded schools. This is just completely wrong. David French is completely wrong.
And this is what we're getting at with a lot of proposals for big tech, regulation of big tech. What are a lot of the proposals for regulating the regulating ideas and the expression of ideas in academia? And to me, that is very dangerous. That is fundamentally illiberal, and is, ironically enough, would create the very legal systems, if it was successful, which it won't be, but if it was successful, would create the very legal foundation for the ability of true ideological hegemony to take off in the United States by degrading the protections of classical liberalism in the First Amendment.
Chris, you have been, a champion of a lot of the legislation that David has been referring to. These bills that are coming in, more than a dozen states, looking to limit the application of, especially in public schools, of the ability of critical race theory to be taught. I'd love for you to explain why you support this legislation, why you think it's important, and why you don't think it's, as I imagine you don't, in any way in conflict with liberalism and liberal values.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a strange argument. It's almost hard to decipher what it is. I mean, it's not a free speech question. In most of the states, we're talking about K through 12 education,
Ding, ding, ding.
state government entities. And as David knows, free speech is designed to protect citizens from the state. The state doesn't have free speech rights. That's not what it was intended to do, or how it's been interpreted by the Supreme Court. So what we're seeing is that the state, where they have a captive audience, right? Students are legally required to attend school. 90% of students in the country attend public schools. So it is a state-run monopoly on primary and secondary education. They're being compelled to affirm the beliefs and tenets of critical race theory. For example, students are being compelled in places like Cupertino, Springfield, Missouri, and New York and Philadelphia to say, in essence, I am so-and-so, I am a white male, I am a member of the oppressor class, and I must atone for these inherent sins of my existence through these kind of ritual mechanisms that have been devised by the Department of Equity and Inclusion. This isn't free speech. This is compelled speech.
Yep.
The state is compelling children who are already being compelled to attend school
and who have not fully developed the logic function of their brain, which doesn't happen until they're in their early to mid 20s.
Affirm a radical ideology that David even described in a column a number of years ago as racial poison. So it's this bizarre idea that, the public school system should have an unlimited right to teach any ideology and even to require a kind of affirmation of this ideology from 5 and 6 year olds, because if we don't do that, it is a violation of free speech. It's like K through 12 education is not a free market in ideas. It's a state-run monopoly. And it's not only the right of legislatures, but it is the obligation of legislatures to make sure that the state-run institutions that are funded by taxpayers reflect the values of those taxpayers. And by putting common sense limits on this, I think it's well within the law. And actually, it's already being done. The state determines the curricula. The bill in Idaho, all it says is no public institution, school district, or public school shall direct or otherwise compel students to personally affirm, adopt, or adhere to any of the following tenets: that any race is inherently superior or inferior, that individuals should be treated differently on the basis of race, or that individuals are inherently responsible for actions committed historically by members of their racial group.
Now, here's where the bill in New Hampshire got all fucked up, because they took out some of those key provisions. And here is the number one provision that is going to make these bills effective against critical race theory being taught in K through 12 schools. They have to have a provision in there that you cannot teach that America is a fundamentally racist country. Everything else stems from that. And I'm talking about a practical level. I'm not talking about a legal level. I'm not talking about anything like that. If teachers have the ability in government funded schools to teach as fact that America is a fundamentally racist country, Everything else stems from that one thing. That was taken out of the bill in New Hampshire, along with some of the stuff that Chris Rufo just mentioned, which is why the bill in New Hampshire, regardless of what any Republican politician is going to lie to you and say, it will not prevent it from being taught in schools here. Now, they're trying some legal challenges from some other stuff. I have no idea about any of that. I have washed my hands of it at this point because I did all I could do, and now they're all running around lying about it.
This is basically saying public schools cannot force students to affirm race essentialism. They cannot force students to participate in racial discrimination, and cannot force students to accept the principles of collective guilt. Those principles are themselves antithetical to liberal tradition. It seems like actually you're maintaining a sense of liberalism by saying these are the guidelines, these are the guardrails, these are things that our public institutions funded by taxpayers should not be promoting in the classroom.
David, how does that strike you?
Little tiny bit of Mott and Bailey going on because
No,
the
there is no Mott and Bailey going on. David French did not follow any of that and does not know what he's talking about. There's no Mott and Bailey going on there.
Idaho bill, for example, is one that is basically a ban on compelled speech, which is
Yes.
already banned. The First Amendment firewalls against compelled speech already.
Well, if it's already... Oh, shit. Did I accidentally... Oh, no!
Support for this podcast, in my view.
David, what do you think?
I just dispute that this radical CRT controls all of these institutions.
Hang on, I gotta find my spot.
For example, students are being compelled in places like Cupertino. School, only the right is inherently seeing a sense of liberalism by
Also receive federal funding.
Hang on,
Protections
hang
for
on.
academic freedom are incredibly to K through 12 education. A ban on compelled speech.
Okay.
Which is
So if it is actually just a ban on compelled speech and compelled speech is already banned, then why do you have a problem with it, David? If it is just a ban on compelled speech and compelled speech is already banned anyway, then why do you have a problem with it? Hey, Red Pill Portal, that was me. And if you want to keep that up, then you're going to get blocked. It's my chat. I'll do what I want. I blocked you. I gave you a timeout. You got a warning. If you want to keep it up, go right ahead.
already banned. The First Amendment firewalls against compelled speech already. I mean, we have very robust constitutional protections against compelled speech. Also, an awful lot of these bills are not limited to K through 12 education. And they're certainly not limited to bans on compelled speech in K through 12 education. So many of them include any kind of...
You're right, because we are allowed to restrict the speech of state employees when they are acting on behalf of the state. You are right, David, that they are not just compelled speech bans. We are allowed to set what the curriculum will be for state employees acting on behalf of the state. That is the entire point. Don't make a First Amendment argument about compelled speech when where you're also ignoring other parts of the argument. Yes, Red Pill Portal, I admit that I just put you in a timeout, and if you want to keep it up, you're going to get permanently blocked. So the choice is yours. You have been warned multiple times, which is more than I do for most people. So if you want to keep acting like a child, I will just block you entirely instead of just putting you in a timeout, which is what I did the first time.
Institution like public colleges and universities, where protections for academic freedom are incredibly well established in constitutional law. So they're going to be struck down when you're talking about public universities. If you're talking about bans, for example, that reach into grant making or private institutions that receive federal funding or state funding, anything like that.
No private institution is required to receive federal funding. No private institution is required or compelled to take our taxpayer dollars. If they don't want to follow the law, then they don't have to take the taxpayer dollars. They're a private institution. They can go get funded elsewhere.
Again, that's going to be struck down under a doctrine called unconstitutional conditions. In other words, that you're often not going to be able to place conditions on the receipt of state funds that would dramatically limit the First Amendment rights of the entity receiving it. So this is something that's been a firewall for example, that allows private religious institutions to receive, for example, GI Bill and other kinds of state benefits without being required to moderate or change their religious instruction. And so a lot of these bills, you have to take in bill by bill by bill. And even if you're talking about K through 12 education, we need to be really careful there, because right now it's kind of up in the air how much of a free speech right a K through 12 teacher has. There's going to be a lot of litigation over this. As of right now, the general rule is they really don't have many free speech, if any at all. But still, you cannot pass a law that's unconstitutionally vague. And a lot of these divisive concept bills are really interesting in that they are not easy to define what is being talked about as a divisive concept.
I'm sorry, what? The bill in New Hampshire had a whole fucking list. It had a bulleted list of specifically what the divisive concepts are. The one that was introduced, not the one that was passed. Had a whole list. Wasn't that hard, David?
And so a lot of those are going to be struck down. And so I think the issue you have here is, yeah, if you're going to pass a law that says that is a prohibition against compelled speech, I'm with you. But the bottom line is, especially when you extend these to universities, they're just going to be struck down. I mean, they're incompatible with existing First Amendment jurisprudence. Now, Chris might take the view that existing First Amendment jurisprudence should be altered, should be changed. The government should be able to put more strings on state funding.
Then allow them to be struck down. Allow the lawsuits are what need to happen anyway. So allow them to be struck down.
Or the government should be.
David French is just arguing to argue. He is okay. David French is just arguing to be relevant in the conversation. Let me put it that way. He's just arguing to be relevant in the conversation. If they get struck down, they get struck down. This is the way the process works.
Be able to put more impositions.
But the fact that they might get struck down, this is an excuse that the right uses all the time. The fact that they might get struck down is not an excuse not to do anything. He's just saying stuff to say stuff. Like, he wasn't relevant in the conversation, so he found a way to insert himself in the conversation. Can't even define the concept he's talking about. Doesn't seem to understand that public school teachers don't have First Amendment protections. Like, I mean, I just don't even, I don't know why I don't know why we are taking David French seriously as a part of this conversation. I completely understand why we're taking Chris Rufo seriously. I do not understand why we're taking David French seriously as a part of this conversation. Yeah, exactly, Sour Kiwis. Intellectuals gonna intellectualize. That's exactly it. That's exactly it.
And more control over state university professors that, sure, make that argument. But what I would say is that when you're beginning to talk about fundamentally degrading these First Amendment protections, that's where I'm beginning to say, look, this is sort of aiming at some foundational principles of liberalism itself. And
if you are funded by the state, I mean, I don't know how many times I have to say this. Like, you're not entitled to our taxpayer money. I'm sorry, you are not entitled to my money.
We've worked very long and hard in the face of an expanding government to create a set of legal doctrines that say, even though the government expands, our rights of conscience and our rights of free speech are maintained, even as the government puts more of its tentacles into American life. And so that would be a rollback. That would place more government.
It would literally be a rollback of government power. David French does not understand this fundamental concept. These laws literally shrink the power of government. They're to control the power of the state. It's not about the government continues to expand and we're reducing individual civil liberties. These laws are about restricting the power of the flipping government.
An authority over your speech if you're a recipient of government funds. And I think that would be a very, very.
You're not entitled to my taxpayer dollars.
Well, I disagree, and I actually think that it's precisely the opposite. This is actually the protection of your right to conscience.
Ding.
There's this kind of strain of naive libertarianism that says any meddling with the state is accepting a statist ideology, and therefore
that's not libertarianism, Chris. I'm sorry, that's not naive. It is not libertarianism to say that, like, you can't mess with the state's power. It is that libertarianism is. I don't know that much about libertarianism. I'm going to learn more in my chat today at 6 p.m. But what I'm pretty sure of is the fact that libertarianism would endorse messing with the government's power, not protecting the government's power. I'm pretty sure of that.
Or we should unilaterally relinquish any authority or any guidance or any shaping of state institutions, state schools, state grant making. But what this does in practice is that it doesn't go away. We haven't reduced the size of government. It just cedes all of that rulemaking, all of that authority to the loudest and the most determined ideologues that operate those institutions. So it's like you can't put any strings on grant making. I mean, grant making in itself is a series of conditions and requirement and evaluative criteria. The idea that you can say, well, we really have.
I'm just curious. Has anyone in the chat ever filled out a grant application? Like has anyone in the chat ever tackled a grant application? Because they're a goddamn nightmare. They really are. So say you can't put any restrictions on grants? I'm sorry. What? No, that is incorrect.
To make this grant making available to all ideologies is absurd. What's the limiting principle on it?
So, Chris, is your position, for example, that the state of California should be able to tell religious colleges and universities that any receipt of federal funds must be conditioned on changing and altering their teaching on the morality and religious orthodoxy of human?
Religious universities are usually private schools. P.S. Religious universities are usually private schools. Religious universities are usually private schools. Religious universities are usually private schools. Let's just say it again for people in the back. Private schools. David.
No, I mean, I'm not even sure how that's related at all. We're talking specifically about public universities.
Yes.
Public K through 12 schools, public agencies. That's the domain that is addressed in these bills. And here's the thing. It's like, if you have a conservative state that has people that have conservative values that are paying out of taxpayer money for these public institutions, those public institutions should reflect the value of the public that funds them. That seems to me a basic democratic truth. And what authority, in your view, does the government have to provide guardrails and guidelines for public instruction and public institutions?
So if I'm a public university professor at Berkeley, let's say I'm at Berkeley Law School, the state of California could require me, under your formulation, to teach CRT as truth.
No.
That's precisely the opposite of what these laws are trying to do. I'm sorry, I'm getting uppity right now because David French is really pissing me off. But that is like the opposite of what these laws are trying to do. The laws literally say you cannot teach it as objective fact. That's the opposite of what David French is like so woefully uninformed on this issue. I'm gonna be honest, like it's actually mind-boggling to me how uninformed he is on this issue when he's considered an expert.
I mean, I didn't formulate that.
No, I mean, that's the legal principle. That the legal principle you're talking about is the government going to public universities and saying, you may not speak these ideas. You must oppose these ideas.
No, none of the bills do that.
Many of them deal with public universities. They deal with...
But look at that. Look at how they construct the language. A lot of the bills have a contextual teaching section in them where they say you can teach these principles in a conceptual manner. You can teach them in a contextual way as competing theories. But what you can't do is force your students to believe X, Y, and Z. And those X, Y's, and Z's are that certain races are inherently superior to other races, that you are guilty for the historical injustices perpetrated by people who look like you, and that you should treat other people differently on the basis of their race, ethnicity, etc. I mean, it's saying, in essence, it's re-articulating those basic premises of the Civil Rights Act, saying you can't treat people differently. You can't say one race is superior to another as a not a contextual discussion of those ideas, which is allowed in all the bills, but as an official state dogma. Which often...
And this is a really critical point. So anytime you hear one of the intellectuals intellectualizing about how critical race theory is going to ban certain books or ban certain concepts, they are flat out lying. They are not reading the bills. What the bills say is that you can teach all this stuff. You just can't teach it as objective fact. You can teach the concepts. You can teach that some people believe these things and some people don't, but you cannot teach it as objective fact. There is a clause in like every single one of the bills that I've looked at that says that. And so anyone who says that these bills prevent the teaching of X, Y, or Z, they're either lying, they haven't read the bills, or they don't understand what they're reading. One of those three things is true.
Sometimes that's what's happening. That's what I've seen in my reporting. And to kind of abstract these things, I think is a huge mistake because we have to deal with concrete problems. And what is the solution to them?
Guys, is there a historical precedent that is helpful for me to understand this better, or that would be helpful to look at here? Like, is it not illegal to teach Christianity in American public schools? Is it, David, explain to us where you're
so
coming
for example,
from a little bit
and
more.
what we're talking about here is, so if you're talking about teaching Christianity as truth in public schools, well, you have an establishment clause, right? So there is an actual constitutional prohibition against teaching Christianity as truthful in public schools. Now, of course, you can teach about Christianity in public schools.
Which is exactly the same as critical race theory. It's exactly the same thing. You can teach about it. You can teach that it exists, but you cannot teach it as objective truth. It is exactly the same thing, David.
Mm-hmm.
You can teach about Christianity in public universities, for example, but there's an establishment clause. That's actually codified. But let's talk about, for example, in Rhode Island. I'm looking at a bill text from Rhode Island. All state and municipal contracts, grants, and training programs entered into after the effective date of this section shall include provisions banning the teaching of divisive
The Rhode Island bill was based on the New Hampshire bill, P.S.
concepts and shall prohibit any individual feeling discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any form of psychological distress on account of their race or sex.
Sure, but again, I mean, that bill went nowhere. It's dead. If that were a law as it stands, I think you would be right. I think that
that bill also had the clause in it about you can't teach these, you can teach the concepts, you just can't teach it as objective fact, because that Rhode Island bill was basically a mirror copy of what got introduced in New Hampshire. So David French just took one little section of the Rhode Island bill and left out a whole other piece of context that was already there. But I mean, that bill is dead. Like, that bill is always going to be dead because Democrats control Rhode Island.
It's not well articulated. It's not well delineated. But look at the laws that are actually passing. I think those are a better test, right?
It's so you're Idaho only, right?
No, it's been signed by both houses.
David doesn't even know where the laws have been passed. David French, in a podcast that aired yesterday, doesn't even know where the laws are being passed. Let me see if I can do a full list now. Idaho, Iowa, Tennessee, Oklahoma. I think there's something in Texas. I think Arizona just got signed. New Hampshire, kind of. And oh God, Florida by executive order.
In Idaho, Tennessee
House. Has it come through? Has it been signed?
Yes, it has been signed
in Senate.
Yes.
It's going to the governor's desk. Yeah.
David, if you
maybe this was recorded a while ago because Tennessee, I'm almost positive Tennessee has been signed. Charles says wokeness is not a religion. Religion is defined as noun, the belief in and worship of superhuman controlling power, especially a personal God or gods. Is there a God in wokeness? Yes, there is a God in wokeness. Thy God is racism. That's why they will never solve racism. They will never fix racism because racism is the God of wokeness.
Think that these laws are an overreach, if you think that these laws are unnecessary because these rights are already protected, what should be done instead? If you're concerned about the spread of CRT in your child's school, what would you recommend to that parent or that policymaker or that lawmaker? What's a better alternative solution than these bills that overwhelmingly you think are unconstitutional or bad?
Yeah. So I think there's a number of things that people can do. Local control of schools is one of the bulwarks of American life. And I think that we need to have more people, more families getting directly and courageously engaged in local school systems. Now, a top-down ban on divisive concepts, because that's what we're talking about. It's not people say it's anti-CRT. The bills say what they say, and they have these very broad bans on.
Oh, is he actually going to make the argument now that when we're talking about divisive concepts, it's not specifically geared at critical race theory because he doesn't know how to define critical race theory, which he already proved in the first section of the damn podcast?
Divisive concepts that when you think through all of the implications, I think they're extremely.
I have had about as much David French today as I can take. Like, I have had enough David French for a lifetime. We're going to finish the last 20 minutes, but I've had enough.
Problematic. But deep engagement in your local school system does matter. Courageous engagement in your local school system does matter. And look, a lot of what you're seeing in major public universities outside of some of these elite institutions like Harvard and Yale, you're not being steeped
in New Hampshire
critical race theory
anyway.
at the University of Tennessee.
In New Hampshire.
My two oldest kids are at the University of Tennessee. And the idea that they're subjected to hegemonic critical race theory teaching there is just not accurate. It's just not true. And so
really? Oh, God damn it. I did it again. God damn it. David is wrong about that, by the way.
Support for this official state ideology
school
bills is that
in your local school system does matter. Courageous engagement in your local school system does matter. And look, a lot of what you're seeing in major public universities outside of some of these elite institutions like Harvard and Yale, you're not being steeped in critical race theory at the University of Tennessee.
Wrong.
I mean, my two oldest kids are at the University of Tennessee. And the idea that they're subjected to hegemonic critical race theory teaching there, it's just not accurate. It's just not true. And so I think what you have is ample opportunity to use your voice to pursue.
David French is going to be surprised when his kids come home from college. I'll tell you what.
To engage in opposition to ideas that you believe that are bad. You have ample opportunity to participate in your local schools and engage with local curriculum. You've got a lot of opportunities in our republic to deal with all of these things through both your voice and your political engagement. But my issue is,
does anyone else kind of wish they could be as willfully ignorant on this topic as David French is? Because I really do. Honest to God, like, I wish every single day that I could be just inserted back into the Matrix. I wish I didn't have to deal with any of this stuff. I wish I didn't know any of this was going on. If I could take a memory wipe pill of some sort, I would seriously consider it, because once you know too much about this stuff, it's just like, it's too much. It's too much. Truman, Return to Reason, says Barry is one of the few remaining journalists in America. French has lost its way. It sucks. He just has absolutely no clue what he's talking about. Yeah, I think Barry Weiss did a decent job with this. I don't know. I get that she's playing moderator to the debate, but it's just like, I really do wish that David French would be called out on specifically some of the falsehoods he's saying, but I think Chris Rufo is doing like an admirable job of it.
As soon as we start talking about fundamentally beginning to shift and change First Amendment doctrine to attack an opposing idea is when I've got alarm bells going off.
I agree with David 100% that it's an imperative that parents get involved. But these are very common sense restrictions. If you had, let's say, a very conservative district in in the southern state where the KKK developed a curriculum, they put it into the classroom and it said, this race is superior to this race. This person should be held accountable for the historical injustices of that person's race. I imagine that David would be very quickly saying, we have to get rid of this. This has to be outlawed. And in principle, it's the same thing. And this is what I think is really the beauty of these bills, is that they're ideologically neutral. These bills are not partisan. They're not ideologically driven to favor the left or the right. They simply say you can't promote race essentialism, you can't promote collective guilt, and you can't promote racial discrimination and treatment of students. So if the KKK were to come up with a school program in a school district somewhere, it would ban that, but it would also ban these illiberal leftist education models. But I think the question is this: why is it that this is only being interpreted as a threat to the left-leaning ideology? Because that's where this illiberal problem lies within our institutions. And I'd be curious. I mean, if
that's actually a really good question. So why are these laws, because they really have been written kind of like nonpartisanly, right? Why are these laws only considered an attack on the left? I think that is actually a really great question, because Chris Rufo is absolutely right in that a lot of these laws could be used to restrict the teachings of the KKK as well. And why wouldn't we want that? Like, I don't want the KKK being taught in school. any more than I want Black Lives Matter being taught in school. I think they're two sides of the same coin. I don't want people being taught that the first thing that they need to look at to make judgments about someone is the color of their skin or their gender or any other things. I think that that's fundamentally dumb. And I think it should be banned in school. Like, and if you can use it to ban one thing, then you can use it to ban another. But the only thing they ever talk about is like the right's using it for this or that or the other thing. Well, the left could use it too. Absolutely.
If a kind of Klan-sponsored curriculum were to make its way to a public school, David, would you defend their right to free speech? Would you defend their right to promote a curriculum of their choice?
I defend everybody's free speech rights, but I would not defend that curriculum in the schools. The bottom line is, and people talk to me about this all the time.
Well, it's a good thing, isn't it, David, that public school teachers paid for by the government are government employees and therefore do not have free speech protections when they're acting in their capacity as public school teachers.
Every single American is entitled to the same rights under the First Amendment, even if their speech is repugnant. So the question here is not, are these ideas good? The question is, what are the limits of constitutional protection? And I agree with you on K through 12, the ability of the state is pretty near its max. And
this has already been decided. This has literally already been decided by the Supreme Court. This is not up for debate.
Its ability to restrict curriculum. However, it's still subjected to prohibitions against passing laws that are unconstitutionally vague. And some of these are sadly unconstitutional.
Give an example. Give an example.
So if there's a question that says, wait, how as a parent would I try to shape the curriculum of the school? Absolutely, I'm going to try to shape the curriculum of the school in a way that constitutionally advances particular values that I agree with. But the idea that says that the state, and again, you agree that many of these statutes should apply to higher education and to grant making?
I think there are different standards. I think that the area of intervention is much stronger in K through 12. Students are required to attend K through 12 at public schools and in many places. So I think the shaping power of the legislation has much more leeway there. I think it has less in the university system. I think that students choose to attend university, but it still is important that the public shapes the values of their public university system. And then with grant making, absolutely. I mean, it's already illegal to provide grants to organizations that discriminate against racial groups. And this is really just a reiteration of that very basic principle that is already under law.
But it's not. It's an argument about ideas and concepts.
It's not.
Divisive concepts is the name of the
title. And there's a list of
most
definitions.
Of the definition sections of these bills. It's divisive concepts.
But what is the verb? Divisive concepts is a noun. The verb is you cannot promote them as truth. You cannot promote them as the official state ideology. You cannot promote them in an affirmative way. Even in the bills that I agree are the most, have the most questions about them with the university system. I don't believe any of them have passed, but they make a specific exemption for classroom teaching. This is really applied to the administration. Is a public university system funded by taxpayers allowed to tell students, you are a member of this race, you are inherently an oppressor, you must write a letter of apology?
So the bill in New Hampshire was actually inspired by a university professor who was forced to take this training and was forced to, I believe, admit that they were an oppressor because of this training and felt like extreme anxiety about even being able to vocalize their opinions. So like Chris Rufo is absolutely right. It doesn't apply to it applies to classroom instruction in exactly the same way. You can teach the concepts, but what it would really target within the university system is this type of training towards staff and staff being having their speech compelled
for the historical crimes of your racial group. Should the university be allowed to do that, David French?
As a classroom exercise?
No, as an administrative exercise. There's exemptions for classroom teaching. Should a public university administration?
Okay, so that's already unlawful. That's already unlawful under the First Amendment. I've had cases,
but they're
like
doing
that.
it. They're doing it. States are typically saying we're going to create another legal recourse, another mechanism to fight back against this.
I totally agree. If you're saying that we want to reaffirm prohibitions on compelled speech, fine. That's the First Amendment. But what you're talking about that's not these bills aside from Idaho.
Yes, that's fundamentally untrue, David French. Go read the goddamn bill. The bill in New Hampshire that was originally introduced 4 pages fucking long. Go read the bill. Sean says Overton window is far left liberals want to keep it. Yeah, I guess so.
That's not the bills. So yeah, you can give me a hypo that says,
David
hey,
French
should
is
I
wrong.
as a
David
student
French
be
is
required
wrong.
to sort
David
of
French is
publish a letter
wrong.
apologizing for my white
He
privilege?
is wrong.
The school right now
He
under the
is
Constitution has
wrong.
no ability to make me do that. None. I've had cases like that. I remember.
And yet I have a database of more than 1,000 institutions that are currently forcing people to do exercises just like that.
It's unconstitutional. File a lawsuit. File a lawsuit. But your bill goes way beyond that. Your bills prohibit far more than that. They're banning more than compelled speech. They are.
But I think you're mistaking. The opposite argument is saying, well, this is going to ban the things that I hear that I think in a way you're echoing is this is going to restrict the teaching of the real history, or this is going to impinge on academic freedom. None of the bills do that. Not one of them.
Under any classic definition of academic freedom, they all infringe upon academic freedom.
David, is there any bill that's being proposed, maybe the answer is Idaho, you'll tell me, that you'd approve of? Or is your objection that basically by and large, these bills are unnecessary because we already have the Constitution and we already have, civil rights law. And so therefore they're unnecessary?
I'm in favor of bills in state legislatures that have codified First Amendment protections, sort of a belt and suspenders approach that we've seen. A number of state legislatures.
Six Semper Tyrannia says, I showed my wife book, Not My Idea, and she was upset what she read, telling kids judged based on skin color. She was looking out for these types of books. Yeah, there are a lot of those books running around right now. Thank you for your super chat.
Legislatures have passed.
Guys, as we wrap up this live stream, just a reminder that I will be doing another live stream in a couple hours at 6 p.m. featuring a nice libertarian discussion of why we can't have nice things with Bill Barger and Dennis Pratt from the Libertarian Party of New Hampshire. Two good guys. I think it's going to be a great kind of calm, non-critical race theory discussion, which I'm very excited about. That'll be at 6 p.m. on this channel. And please make sure you mount that like button if you have enjoyed this stream so far today.
Free speech laws that essentially what they do is they get rid of things like speech codes. So, in Tennessee, we have a very robust free speech law that applies to college campuses. So what you're doing is sort of a belt and suspenders approach on the Constitution, on the First Amendment, because both the legislature and the courts have obligations to uphold and defend the Constitution. So the Idaho law is the closest thing that I have come to something that replicates constitutional protections. These other laws do not do that. They do not.
David French has not read the other laws.
What they do is they ban the expression of particular viewpoints. Now, in certain circumstances,
public school teachers do not have free speech protections. They don't. They do not have free speech protections when they are acting in their capacity as public school teachers, David French.
That's going to be lawful because the relevant state employee doesn't have free speech rights in that context in the same way that other state employees do. But when you're talking about most of these bills, what you're talking about is the ban of an expression of a particular viewpoint. And that is not what the Constitution requires.
Do you guys see the debate over these particular bills as exemplifying the divide inside the world of the right, the Republican Party, the conservative movement between traditionalists, small L, libertarians like David, and maybe what some have called the new right, which to me...
Does David French think he's a libertarian? So true story, like, I really have no idea who David French is, other than I know he's been running his mouth about this is like pretty much my first introduction to David French. Honest question for the chat, does David French think he's a libertarian? Because I don't think that David French is a libertarian. I don't. Not at all. Not in any way.
Me, Chris, I see you as an emerging figure in that movement. Is that the right way to look at the debate over these bills?
I mean, it depends on what the bill says. I mean, that's critically important here, because if you're talking about a bill that all it does...
David, you haven't even read the bills. We know you haven't read the bills because we have read the bills and we know what they say. So don't harp on the fact that we should actually know what the bills say when you haven't bothered to read the bills. Yeah, Truman, that's what I thought, is that he was a conservative. I didn't know he considered himself a libertarian.
Is codify the First Amendment or an element of the First Amendment, then that's totally consistent with my longstanding approach to higher education and defending free speech rights in higher education, longstanding approach to protecting the First Amendment in secondary education. But if the bill is going beyond the First Amendment to ban and prohibit the teaching of particular viewpoints in institutions that enjoy First Amendment protection and with people who enjoy First Amendment protection, then that's where I'm absolutely going to.
Does anyone know what I'm going to say right now in the chat? Do we know what I'm gearing up to say? Chat in what you think I'm going to say before I have to say it for the 5,000th time. This little pop quiz. This is a pop quiz to see if you guys are paying attention. What do you think I'm going to say to David French's idea that these bills are limiting free speech? What am I going to say? I'm looking in the chat right now for some answers. We're going to see. I know it takes a second here. I know it takes a second to catch up. God. Could anyone have written David French like a memo? Yes! Yes! Your pal, the government does not have free speech protections. Adrian, state employees don't have First Amendment protections. Return to reason, government employees don't have 1A rights. Duh! No free speech protection for state employees. You, sir, are an idiot. Exactly. Public school teachers are state employees. They do not have free speech rights in their capacity as teachers. They are limiting government control. They do not have free speech laws. Government schools is not free speech because it is enforced. Government employees do not have free speech protections. I'm going to write a whole song that says that government employees don't have free speech protections, David French.
Apart. You know, when I think if you had to nail down a big difference between Chris and it's I want to hear the ideas of critical race theorists. I want to hear them. I have learned from critical race theorists. I disagree with a lot of what they have to say. I don't disagree with all of what they have to say. But the bottom line is, in a marketplace of ideas dealing with incredibly complex problems in American life, I want to hear from them. I want to. And the idea that we're going to go out of our way to ban people from expressing those ideas in a way that's designed to get people to adopt those ideas, yikes.
But I would like to make a distinction between someone exercising their First Amendment rights as an individual citizen to express their ideas, which is quite different from the idea that you are entitled to have the state subsidize that ideology, which is a principle that I reject wholeheartedly.
But maybe this is the crux of the disagreement. You know, you want to hear from them. Chris says, I'm willing to hear from them, but let's not mince words. Let's not delude ourselves. A big part of what they are up to is trying to erase, David, your ideas and make it look like there isn't a debate and make it seem like theirs is the only truth and, in fact, the only morality. And therefore, it is something closer to indoctrination than a real debate.
Oh, there's no question that there are elements of critical race theory that want to not hear from me.
Oh, I strongly doubt that,
I mean, this
David.
is, again, let's go back to the rise of the speech code. And, you know, one of the things about my litigation career is we plowed down these speech codes time and time and time again. At one point, you know, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, with its speech code database, said about 80% of leading colleges and universities had a speech code in place. And a speech code is any code that would prohibit speech that is otherwise protected by the Constitution. By their most recent database, it's down to about 25% of colleges and universities. The leading colleges and universities have a clearly unconstitutional policy. So yeah, you know, one of the things that is really important is, yes, I want to hear, but also I'm going to defend absolutely my right to disagree. And any ideology, whether it comes from the right or the left, that is going to...
You have a right to disagree, David, but you do not have a right to overrule the Supreme fucking Court.
be diving in to say that there are certain ideas that I'm going to try to ban people from urging their adoption. I'm going to resist that. I'm going to resist that just as vigorously as I'm going to resist any effort to ban the ideas that I hold and the beliefs that I hold.
I'd love it if we could end with something a little bit more personal. In this moment
Really?
where a lot of people are trying to fit us all into neat.
Sixth Emperor Tyrannus says people who are for CRT are in charge and are shutting down counterpoints like in school boards. This guy has no clue what he is talking about. That's exactly correct. And I hate to really beat the dead horse, but this is the difference between the intellectuals and people who actually exist in the real world. The intellectuals oftentimes do not know the end result of their intellectualization, nor do they really care, because the goal is not to solve problems. The goal is not to impact the lives of real people. The goal is to pat themselves on the back and have a whiskey and a cigar with their pinky out like this to congratulate themselves for being such fine intellectuals. That's what the goal is. It's to impress themselves. It's not to actually impact the real lives of real people.
Political categories and also neat racial categories. You both come from racially mixed families. Chris, your children are biracial. David, you have a few children, one of them an adopted daughter who's Black. And I guess I'm wondering if you could talk about how you guys are communicating with your children, especially your younger children, about everything that's happening in this moment, how they should think about their identities, and how they should think about what it means to be American.
I try to, with my kids, they're still young, but I try to just develop their individual potential to the greatest extent possible. My kids are half Asian American, and critical race theory and the policies that they support are explicitly anti-Asian and discriminatory in a policy-driven way throughout the education system and elsewhere. So I just try to basically teach them, who are you as an individual human being? What is the potential and gift that you have, and how can we cultivate it to the maximum ability? And, my wife grew up in a deeply poor and dysfunctional.
Return to reason, French. We don't need to address things already against the Constitution. Also, 25% of colleges have speech codes in violation of the Constitution. The intellectual is going to intellectualize.
Slum of Thailand. She immigrated to this country and has been an enormous success that would never have been offered to her anywhere else in the world. And so we both have an enormous gratitude for this country. We can understand where there are problems and things that need to be fixed, but ultimately we're believers in this system. And I think that the reforms that we might need have to come from within the fundamental values and beliefs of this country. And those are the things that we try to pass on to our kids.
So we have a kind of a unique issue in that my daughter has been exposed to quite explicit racism that she's experienced in her own life that she understands as racism and experiences as racism, including, just comments and actions that are really just way, way over the line. And so we've had to work with her through those experiences, and it's very deeply wounding to her. And we haven't even scratched the surface of the hurricane of hate that was sent her direction during 2015, 2016. And so there's going to be a point in time where we're going to have to cross that bridge, and we're going to have to deal with that. And that this just giant hurricane of hatred that came towards our family and expressly directed directly at her, a child from the hardcore alt-right.
Wow.
So we've got a kind of a unique problem on our hands. And I'll be honest, I don't know all the ways to how to cross that bridge. I don't have it all figured out. I do have an enormous amount of confidence that we can provide for her not just a loving home, but an incredible amount of opportunity to succeed and flourish in this country, and that she is flourishing right now in a way that we're incredibly blessed by. And all of those, so my basic point of view is I'm trying to say, what are all of those things that are helping her flourish? I want to double down on that. What are all of those things that have created the hatred and the obstacles? And I want to stand against that. So that's where I am right now. And this is hard stuff. Like, it's hard stuff. You know, one thing I want to end on with this in our discussion with Chris and I, all of this stuff that we're talking about is hard. It's not easy. There's not easy, obvious answers for this really deep-seated cultural and political and social problems that we've had over the course of the United States. And that's why these kinds of conversations that we've had are really, I think, really important. They give people an opportunity to hear two competing good faith answers about how to work through all of this. And I think that that's really, really important. And, you know, we're in process on all of this. You know, Chris talks about the anti-Asian bias that we've seen emerge. And hopefully the Supreme Court will take a case pretty soon that will deal with that. You know, it seems to me that a lot of the anti-Asian bias that we're dealing with not only violates the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, it violates Title VI, it violates Title VII. There's a lot of legal provisions that it stands against. And so, yeah, I think the bottom line is all of those things that contribute to the human flourishing of Chris's kids, of my kids, my youngest daughter, I want to figure that out. I want to double down on that. All of those forces that have been unleashed, that have resulted in the kinds of discrimination and hatred that she's faced, I stand opposed to it. It's an easy formulation to make. It's a hard formulation to figure out. It's hard to figure out what has caused this, how we can deal with it. That's very difficult.
All right, we're going to end it there. Looks like I only have about a minute left anyway, but David's French is kind of spinning his wheels. Like, well, where I will agree on this last one is I do not think, like, one of the things that really bothers me about critical race theory is that and frankly, like, the backlash to it on the right is that I do think in the process of simply backlashing against what the left is doing, the right is leaving a lot on the table in terms of, like, things that are actually important. Like, racism does exist. Let's just be blunt here for a second. Like, racism does actually exist. There are actually problems. And so what I see happening on the right now is that they're so intent on backlashing against everything the left is doing, regardless of nuance or any of those things, that they might be putting themselves in a position to just deny that racism is even a thing, or deny. I mean, I see it all the time. Like, I'm gonna be honest. Like, I very much think misogyny is at play in the way that, like, I've been spoken to in the last month. I absolutely do, and I don't pull the woman card all that often. But there is actually something different about it, and the right just completely dismisses that. And so, if the right is going to completely dismiss these things that are happening, that are very real, then I think that what they're going to end up doing is actually just helping critical race theory to proliferate, because they're going to, like, people that are worried about these things are going to be looking towards some solution. And if the right is saying, no, nothing is happening, nothing to see here, we can't see it, I don't know what you're talking about, we can't see it. If that's what they're going to do, then they're only going to push people to these far left tactics. And that's just the way it is. Britt, thank you for hanging out. Britt, throwing out some cash to fluff the feathers of your trolls before I head out, because you're awesome. Britt, I think you're awesome as well. Now that my life is actually starting to get back together, would love to be back on your show sometime. Anytime, my friend. Not this week. But anytime after this week would be great. But guys, thank you for hanging out with me. I just thought, like, I had to listen to the podcast anyway because it was recommended by a member of my locals community. Again, if you have not joined my locals, we'll just do one final plug for that. Maybe if I can find my locals somewhere on the screen. Okay, I can't. I'll get a banner up here and show you guys how you can join my locals. kb.locals.com. You can join for free just to check it out. If you want to support me, which the very best thing you can do to support my work is by becoming a member of my locals community. $5 a month, $50 a year. You can find the information in the link below. Lots of my locals members are here in the chat today. It's awesome. I will be back in about an hour and a half. I'm going to take a little break. I'm going to go do some laundry, go do some other stuff I need to do. I'm going to be back in here in about an hour and a half with a great discussion with Bill and Dennis from the New Hampshire Libertarian Party. And we're going to talk about, can voluntarism allow us to have nice things? So I will see you guys then. Have a great day. Until then, go take a break, go get a drink, go get a coffee, whatever you need to do. And we'll see you guys back here at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Bye-bye for now.